Okay, welcome back to part 2 of our photosynthesis lesson. And we're going to start by returning to our photosynthesis equation. Now, this is the equation that I gave you to start with. But in the last portion of this lesson, I said it was simplified as an overview. And also, we can tell if we look at the numbers of atoms on each side that it's not balanced. So for you guys, for your exam, you will need to know it in more detail. And here is the detail. First of all, if we look at the elements on either side, we can see that there's now equal numbers of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. So this number here tells us how many molecules of carbon dioxide, 6, go in, 12 molecules of water for every single molecule of glucose that's produced, and then that will generate 6 molecules of oxygen. However, you may also have noticed that in the simplified equation, there was water on the inputs, but there was no water on the outputs, on the product side. That's not a mistake, and this is more complicated, and the previous simplified version literally was that, to keep things simple. But in that whole set of reactions which go to making photosynthesis work, water comes in chemically. It doesn't just come as a solvent. It comes in and the hydrogen and the oxygen get broken up and shifted around. The bonds get broken and shifted around in creating glucose. And then more reactions happen and recreate water on the other side, chemically, not just as a solvent sitting there keeping everything dissolved. So that's the reason that, to be more accurate with the total picture of photosynthesis, we have water as an input, a chemical input, and water as a chemical output. That is the equation that you will need to memorize for the exam. All right, let's look at our next consideration of photosynthesis, limiting factors. Now, most biological processes, including photosynthesis, and I'm going to abbreviate photosynthesis as PS from here on for brevity, most biological processes are affected by what is happening in the environment. Any variable, that is anything that can change in the environment and that can affect the rate of photosynthesis of a process, including photosynthesis, is known as a limiting factor. And for photosynthesis, these include temperature, carbon dioxide concentration or amount that's available, light intensity, and the color of the light. Now, that's something that we are going to look at in some more detail, quite a bit of detail in upcoming slides. If we look at these three, carbon dioxide, because it's an input at the beginning to the chemical process, if there's no carbon dioxide, then there's no photosynthesis at all. And similarly with light intensity, if there's zero light intensity, then photosynthesis can't happen at all. So as these two increase, you're going to get more and more photosynthesis, at least up to a certain level. With temperature, it's not so simple. Very low temperatures will stop photosynthesis, but very high temperatures will stop it as well. So there's going to be an optimum there. And light wavelength is something that we need to look at because that's more complicated than either of those other three. But all of these are limiting factors. That is, if you have the wrong levels of them, photosynthesis will either slow down or stop altogether. All right, let's look at this complicated issue of wavelengths. The first thing is a fact that you may already know from previous lessons, and that is that white light is not a single kind of light. It's the outcome of seeing all the colors of the rainbow all together at once. The term that is used for a rainbow for the full set of colours is the visible light spectrum. The word spectrum simply means the whole range of something from one extreme to the other extreme. Now, in this diagram, I've taken a colour wheel, so the spectrum is represented in a circle, and I've pretended that we've blended all of those. So, for instance, if we had those colours and spun that wheel extremely fast, then we would lose the individual colours and we would end up with just white. White light can go the other way. If you put pure white light through a prism, that's one of those little triangles of glass, then you can split up the white back into its original colours. The visible spectrum is only a small fraction of what is known as the electromagnetic spectrum. And this is a bit of background to give you some perspective and set the scene for what's going on in photosynthesis. In particular, though, all electromagnetic energy, including visible light, moves in the form of waves. And the distance from the peak of one wave to the peak of the next, so imagine that this could be a wave on the sea. It would still be known as the wavelength, but also the energy of light and these other forms of energy move in waves, and the distance from there to there is known as the wavelength, which makes sense because it's the length of the wave. Here is another diagram, and this section is the visible light, and we can see it all spread out there. Beyond, if the wavelengths get longer, as we can see on the right-hand side here, then the energy is less and it becomes invisible. If we go to the other side and the wavelengths get shorter, then the energy is more intense, but it also becomes invisible. We can't see it. So it's only this region here where we get these visible wavelengths of light. All right. Just try and escape. All right, good. So, the only physical difference between all of these kinds of electromagnetic energy is the wavelength. However, those different wavelengths and those different energies have different impacts on the environment, including plants and including photosynthesis. So, because we are really only concerned about photosynthesis, the different wavelengths of visible light have different efficiencies in making the light reactions or the light dependent reactions happen. Blue light gets absorbed by chlorophyll. That's the green pigment that's making photosynthesis happen. And then red light is the next most efficient. Green light is reflected and yellow light is only absorbed a tiny little bit. And that's the reason that plants look green, because white light comes in from the sun, the blue light gets absorbed, the red light gets absorbed, a bit of the yellow gets absorbed, but the green is reflected. It's not absorbed at all, and so the pigment looks green, the leaves look green, the plant looks green. And here is a graph. On the x-axis, we see the wavelengths of visible light. A nanometer is a billionth of a meter, so these are incredibly small distances. So your purplish color is around 400 nanometers wavelength, and your red, far red, really strong red color is around 750 nanometers. As the wavelength gets slightly longer, the color of the light becomes bluish, and that gives us the best photosynthesis. If we had slightly paler blue light moving towards green, then we see that the rate of photosynthesis is going to drop off. We get to the green, still some is happening. We're still getting some photosynthesis, but a lot of that energy is not being picked up. We move up through yellow and then orange and into red, and now we get another peak around this sort of orangey red color where we're getting really good photosynthesis. Not quite as good as we did with the blue, but good nevertheless. And then as we move up towards going towards infrared, that's the really long wavelengths, then photosynthesis drops off altogether. Just note that this color spectrum has been swapped around compared to the diagram on the previous slide. So that one went left to right, this is going right to left. All right, just for the record, the standard unit of light intensity is the lux. So the unit for distance, or our common unit for distance, is meters. Our unit for temperature is degrees Celsius. Our unit for mass is kilograms or grams. The unit for light intensity is lux. And just for the record, if the intensity of light gets below about 500 lux, and that's the sort of intensity you'd get from fluorescent bulbs in a standard retail store with no sunlight coming in. So at night, and that's the only light coming from the fluoro bulbs, that's going to be about 500 lux. Now we think of that as pretty bright. That's all we need to see. But most plants need more than that. Some plants, rainforest plants that are used to growing in the shade of other trees, they can survive there, and they're going to be your sort of office plants. But other plants are not going to survive. They just don't do photosynthesis well enough. At the other extreme, once you get up around 10,000 lux, so that's a lot brighter, then photosynthesis it's not going to burn the plant. The plant just can't use any more light. So that's the maximum that photosynthesis is going to be capable of using, is around 10,000 lux. All right, well, that concludes our part B of the photosynthesis lessons. We've now covered the issues of balancing the full chemical equation, and we've looked at the limiting factors, especially the issue of light and light colors. And that will conclude our little mini series on photosynthesis.